In the cold November of 1999, as the city of New York braced itself for the new millennium, a chill more bone-deep than the falling temperature settled over the Bronx. When 13-year-old Liz Minnie Soriano vanished on her way home from school, her disappearance was subtle at first, a soft note of absence amidst the urban chaos, until days later, when her lifeless body was found stuffed into a dumpster near her school. The community's numb confusion transformed into horror. The city moved on as it often does, but a handful of individuals, including a determined NYPD detective named Daniel Reyes, could never quite shake the gravity of that case. Reyes, a seasoned investigator in his late 40s with deep-set eyes that mirrored the weight of every unsolved crime he'd ever carried, wore the same charcoal gray trench coat and black turtleneck every winter day he went on duty. His brown leather notebook was filled with names, addresses, half-formed theories, and observations scribbled in hurried loops, while the silver pocket watch he kept in his coat's inner lining ticked with mechanical persistence, a symbol of all the time lost in unsolved mysteries like Liz's. In the cold November of 1999, as the city of New York braced itself for the new millennium, a chill more bone-deep than the falling temperature settled over the Bronx when 13-year-old Liz Minnie Soriano vanished on her way home from school. Her disappearance was subtle at first, a soft note of absence amidst the urban chaos, until days later, when her lifeless body was found stuffed into a dumpster near her school. The community's numb confusion transformed into horror. The city moved on as it often does, but a handful of individuals, including a determined NYPD detective named Daniel Reyes, could never quite shake the gravity of that case. Reyes, a seasoned investigator in his late 40s with deep-set eyes that mirrored the weight of every unsolved crime he'd ever carried, wore the same charcoal gray trench coat and black turtleneck every winter day he went on duty. His brown leather notebook was filled with names, addresses, half-formed theories, and observations scribbled in hurried loops, while the silver pocket watch he kept in his coat's inner lining ticked with mechanical persistence, a symbol of all the time lost in unsolved mysteries like Liz's. In the cold November of 1999, as the city of New York braced itself for the new millennium, a chill more bone-deep than the falling temperature settled over the Bronx when 13-year-old Liz Minnie Soriano vanished on her way home from school. Her disappearance was subtle at first, a soft note of absence amidst the urban chaos, until days later, when her lifeless body was found stuffed into a dumpster near her school. The community's numb confusion transformed into horror. The city moved on as it often does, but a handful of individuals, including a determined NYPD detective named Daniel Reyes, could never quite shake the gravity of that case. Reyes, a seasoned investigator in his late 40s with deep-set eyes that mirrored the weight of every unsolved crime he'd ever carried, wore the same charcoal gray trench coat and black turtleneck every winter day he went on duty. His brown leather notebook was filled with names, addresses, half-formed theories, and observations scribbled in hurried loops, while the silver pocket watch he kept in his coat's inner lining ticked with mechanical persistence, a symbol of all the time lost in unsolved mysteries like Liz's. In the cold November of 1999, as the city of New York braced itself for the new millennium, a chill more bone-deep than the falling temperature settled over the Bronx when 13-year-old Liz Minnie Soriano vanished on her way home from school. Her disappearance was subtle at first, a soft note of absence amidst the urban chaos, until days later, when her lifeless body was found stuffed into a dumpster near her school. The community's numb confusion transformed into horror. The city moved on as it often does, but a handful of individuals, including a determined NYPD detective named Daniel Reyes, could never quite shake the gravity of that case. Reyes, a seasoned investigator in his late 40s with deep-set eyes that mirrored the weight of every unsolved crime he'd ever carried, wore the same charcoal gray trench coat and black turtleneck every winter day he went on duty. His brown leather notebook was filled with names, addresses, half-formed theories, and observations scribbled in hurried loops, while the silver pocket watch he kept in his coat's inner lining ticked with mechanical persistence, a symbol of all the time lost in unsolved mysteries like Liz's. In the cold November of 1999, as the city of New York braced itself for the new millennium, a chill more bone-deep than the falling temperature settled over the Bronx when 13-year-old Liz Minnie Soriano vanished on her way home from school. Her disappearance was subtle at first, a soft note of absence amidst the urban chaos, until days later, when her lifeless body was found stuffed into a dumpster near her school. The community's numb confusion transformed into horror. The city moved on as it often does, but a handful of individuals, including a determined NYPD detective named Daniel Reyes, could never quite shake the gravity of that case. Reyes, a seasoned investigator in his late 40s with deep-set eyes that mirrored the weight of every unsolved crime he'd ever carried, wore the same charcoal gray trench coat and black turtleneck every winter day he went on duty. His brown leather notebook was filled with names, addresses, half-formed theories, and observations scribbled in hurried loops, while the silver pocket watch he kept in his coat's inner lining ticked with mechanical persistence, a symbol of all the time lost in unsolved mysteries like minor lies. Detective Daniel Reyes stood silently outside the crime lab, as cold air bit at the edges of his collar, his charcoal trench coat fluttering slightly in the wind, while the black turtleneck beneath clung tightly to his frame, a reminder that the past clung even tighter. The evidence had returned a positive match, and that discarded piece of chewing gum, a remnant of an idle moment, had spoken louder than a confession. He remembered the way the gum had looked inside the bag, so ordinary, so stupidly mundane, and yet it held the weight of 20 years. He had retrieved it as part of a quiet ritual, one in which every breath, every movement had been calibrated to avoid disturbing the invisible thread that connected him to Minor Liza's forgotten story. The city had changed, apartment complexes renovated, roads expanded, stores turned over tenfold, but her case hadn't. Her name hadn't. Her loss hadn't. Reyes walked into the lab, the echo of his shoes on tile like a metronome of justice. Long delayed, the technician, young and sharp, offered a tight nod. "It's a match," she said, her voice low and steady, handing him the official report. He didn't respond. Instead, he took out his silver pocket watch, opened the lid, and stared at the hands ticking forward, always forward. In that moment, time folded in on itself. He wasn't just an aging detective in 2021. He was the same man from 1999, standing outside the dumpster where her body was found, holding a small evidence bag with trembling hands. Now, instead of a nameless killer, he had a name, Joseph Martinez. The name struck him like a dull thud, ordinary, unremarkable. Martinez lived a few blocks from where Minor Liza had vanished, worked at a distribution warehouse, paid taxes, had no priors. For 20 years, he blended into the fabric of the city with the comfort of someone who thought no one was looking. But Reyes had been looking, even when no one else had, even when the precinct forgot. He spent the next hours going through Martinez's background, assembling the timeline, mapping his movements, cross-referencing old transit logs and school records. His brown leather notebook overflowed with looping notes and arrows. Martinez had been 24 when Minor Liza died. He lived with his sister then, just 4 blocks from the school. No direct connection was found, no relation to the victim, no shared neighbors, but Reyes had learned over decades that killers didn't always leave logic behind. Sometimes all they left was DNA, and now that DNA had a voice, surveillance was set up. Reyes, always one to trust instinct over digital shortcuts, chose to trail Martinez in person. Early mornings, late nights, blending with the backdrop of the city. He tracked him, watching as Martinez bought coffee from a corner shop, fed pigeons in the park, visited a local bar on Saturdays, always alone. No signs of guilt, no signs of fear. Either he had forgotten, or worse, he never cared. One evening, as Martinez dropped a receipt into a sidewalk bin and strolled away without a glance, Reyes stood under a flickering streetlight, his breath fogging the winter air, watching from a distance. The city had 1,000 shadows, and that night, he was one of them. He retrieved the receipt for no reason other than habit, but it didn't matter. The gum was enough. The match was made. It was time. Back at the precinct, Reyes sat with Captain Delgado, a longtime colleague and friend who had once worked the case before moving to a different unit. Delgado looked at the report, whistled low. "That gum," he muttered. "Can't believe it. You finally got him." Reyes didn't smile. "She finally got him," he said, sliding the file across the table. The rest was coordinated for. Early morning, Reyes insisted on being there, even if protocol said otherwise. He arrived before dawn, dressed as always in his charcoal trench coat and black turtleneck, the silver pocket watch ticking faintly beneath his coat. As the officers approached Martinez's door, Reyes stood just behind them, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the doorway like a man waiting for a ghost. Martinez opened the door wearing slippers and a fleece hoodie, groggy and unaware. The moment he saw the badge, his face didn't fall. There was no shock, no collapse, just confusion, followed by the briefest flash of something else. Resignation, perhaps. Martinez was handcuffed without resistance, seated in the back of a cruiser while neighbors peeked from behind blinds. Reyes didn't speak during the ride. He sat beside him, quiet, his eyes locked on Martinez's profile, trying to read what kind of man could take a child's life and carry on like nothing happened. At the station, Martinez was processed, fingerprinted, photographed. Reyes stood in the observation room as detectives conducted the first interview. Martinez denied everything. Of course, said he didn't know the girl, said the gum could have been planted, said anything but the truth. But the DNA was absolute. A grand jury would see the report. The court would hear the forensic testimony. The evidence was no longer a theory, it was a voice from the grave. Reyes left the precinct late that night, walked 10 blocks in the cold, and found himself standing at the mural that had been painted for Minalez just 2 years prior. Faded now, cracked with weather and age. He ran a gloved hand over the bricks. He didn't cry. Not anymore. But he stood there for a long time. The wind curled around him like a whisper. His notebook stayed shut. His watch ticked on. In that moment, he wasn't a detective or a ghost, hunter or a man chasing lost time. He was just someone who remembered when no one else did. The trial of Joseph Martinez gripped the city in a way few cold cases ever had, not just because of its brutality, but because of the bizarre nature of its resolution, solved by a piece of chewing gum forgotten in a backpack for 2 decades. Detective Daniel Reyes sat in the courtroom every day, wearing the same charcoal trench coat and black turtleneck, never speaking to press, never drawing attention to himself, but always present, always watching, as if willing the verdict forward. Through sheer force of will, the courtroom buzzed with quiet energy during each proceeding, reporters filling the back benches, and the victim's family seated stiffly at the front. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision, how the gun was recovered, how it was stored all these years, and how recent advancements in DNA technology, specifically familial searching, had finally pointed to Martinez. The defense pushed back, claiming contamination, claiming coincidence, even suggesting conspiracy. But Reyes knew the truth didn't tremble under pressure. It only waited. Every time the forensic technician took the stand, the jurors leaned forward slightly, drawn to the clean science behind the horror. It wasn't just about a crime anymore. It was about the cold math of biology catching up with someone who thought time had buried his secrets. Reyes kept a close eye on Martinez. He watched how he sat rigid but composed, how he whispered occasionally to his lawyer, how he never looked toward the victim's family. There were no tears, no anger, just stillness. Sometimes Reyes wondered whether Martinez had ever thought of her at all since that day, whether he'd buried it so deep in his mind that even he couldn't touch it, or whether it lived there like a quiet trophy. The jury selection had been meticulous. The trial was projected to last 3 weeks, but it extended beyond a month, as expert after expert was brought forward. One particular moment lodged in Reyes' mind like a splinter. When the coroner who had originally examined Minalez's body returned to testify, now retired and slowed by age, he still carried the same solemn gravity. He described the injuries, the positioning, the cold. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Martinez stared straight ahead. Reyes stared at him. He wanted to believe that even monsters felt the weight of truth. But monsters, he'd learned, often wore very human skin. Outside the courtroom, the media swarmed, but Reyes avoided interviews. He gave one statement through a spokesperson: "This is Minalez's story, not mine." That night, he walked alone through the city, his trench coat pulled tight against the wind. He stopped by her old school, boarded now and scheduled for demolition. He stood across the street, imagining her walking down the sidewalk, backpack slung over her shoulder, gum in her mouth, unaware that someone had decided to rewrite the ending of her life. Without her permission, as the trial progressed, Reyes reread his notebook every night, flipping through every detail he had ever gathered, comparing old interviews, photos, statements, searching for the one thread he might have missed. Not out of doubt, but out of duty. One detail stayed with him. A store clerk from 1999 had mentioned seeing Martinez near the school the week of the murder, buying a soda. Back then, it meant nothing. There were no security cameras, no receipts, just memory, but now it placed him closer than ever before. Reyes tracked the clerk down, still living in Queens, and asked for a new statement. The man remembered the soda, the gum, and how Martinez had seemed anxious that day. Looking over his shoulder, it wouldn't be admissible in court to vague, but it fortified Reyes' belief. The timeline held, the evidence held, the truth held. Back in court, closing arguments began. The prosecutor spoke with the righteous cadence of someone standing on solid ground. This case is not just about DNA, she said. It's about a young girl whose life was stolen and a man who thought he could wait out justice. The defense argued desperation and accused the NYPD of tunnel vision. Reyes listened without flinching. He knew the truth didn't need drama. It just needed to be told. When the jury went into deliberation, the room deflated. The energy shifted. From performance to waiting, Reyes returned to the precinct and sat alone in the case room. Surrounded by dusty boxes and old Polaroids, he took out the chewing gum bag once more. He didn't need to, he just wanted to look at it. It was hardened now, pale pink against clear plastic, something so small, so silly, that held the voice of a murdered child. The call came the next afternoon. The jury had returned. Reyes arrived at the courthouse early, taking his seat in the far left pew, away from cameras. The room was silent. Martinez was brought in. The foreman stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Joseph Martinez, guilty of murder in the second degree. The words seemed to suspend in the air for a moment before crashing down with a collective breath. Reyes didn't move. He didn't blink. He only looked forward. Martinez didn't react. The judge spoke, thanking the jury, reminding everyone of courtroom decorum. The press surged. The family wept. Reyes stood quietly and walked out a side door, descending the steps alone as reporters shouted questions behind him. He didn't stop. He didn't answer. He walked 5 blocks to a quiet bench near the Bronx River, removed his watch, and listened to its ticking in the hollow of his palm. 1 case down, 800 to go. But this one mattered, because it reminded the city that no detail was too small, that even forgotten gum could carry a scream, that sometimes justice wasn't loud. It was just patient. After the trial ended, Detective Daniel Reyes found himself lingering at the precinct long after his shift, sitting at his desk in the same charcoal trench coat and black turtleneck, the smell of old paper and cold coffee surrounding him as he leafed through other unsolved case files that now demanded his attention. Though justice had been served for Minorless, the silence that followed her case felt heavier than the noise, because the echo of one solved case only emphasized the weight of those still unanswered, those still waiting for someone to care enough to look. Reyes knew the world would move on, the headlines would fade, but some part of him refused to release the thread that had connected him to that forgotten girl. In his office, he pinned her photo back on the wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He glanced down at the worn leather notebook, its pages filled with years of dead ends and buried clues, and turned to a case from 2002. Another young girl, another unsolved murder, another cold body in a warm city. It wasn't just duty anymore. It was legacy. Reyes spent the following weeks compiling data, tracking advances in DNA, and organizing old evidence files, especially those containing biological traces. He worked closely with the new generation of forensic analysts, those who had cut their teeth on digital evidence, touched DNA, and familial tracing. He wore his usual uniform trench coat, turtleneck, polished boots, and moved like a ghost in a world of neon screens and algorithmic search engines. Despite his analog ways, he was respected. He had brought closure to a 20-year-old question. People listened now. Reyes met with the forensic team who had handled the chewing gum. He asked them what other archived samples could be viable. Plenty, the lead technician said, pointing to a storage room. We just need someone willing to ask the right questions. That night, Reyes sat alone on a metal chair inside that room, surrounded by boxes marked with faded labels. Each box held a name, a date, and a plea for justice. He opened one marked Grace W., 2002. Inside was a scarf, a button, a hair tie. No DNA report had ever been filed. Technology wasn't there back then, but now, with touch DNA and rapid processing, there was a chance. Reyes filled out the forms. He signed off the chain of custody. He took the box to the lab. He didn't say a word. In the weeks that followed, Reyes became a fixture at the lab, coffee in one hand, case folder in the other, always wearing that trench coat, even when the heating made the room uncomfortably warm. He sat beside the text, watching graphs, reviewing sequences. He wasn't trained in molecular biology, but he understood pattern. He understood silence. And most importantly, he understood waiting. As he worked, letters began to arrive at the precinct. Thank yous, cards from Minor Liza's old classmates, emails from other families with cold cases asking him to look into their daughters, sons, parents. Reyes read everyone. He made a list. He created a second notebook, red leather, this time exclusively for leads he would follow. He began calling retired officers who had once worked those files. Some didn't answer. Some barely remembered. Some were still haunted. Reyes wrote down every detail, cross-referenced every name. His office became cluttered again, not with old dust, but with fresh momentum. One evening, as rain streaked the windows, Reyes received a call from the lab. The scar from Grace W.'s case had yielded a partial match, male DNA, strong enough to build a profile. Reyes sat in his chair for a long time, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his desk, the tick of his pocket watch echoing inside the room. He closed his eyes. Minor Liza had opened the door. Now, others could walk through. Reyes requested an update from the FBI CODIS database. A hit came back 2 days later. The man was already in prison serving time for an unrelated robbery. He'd never been tied to any murder before. Reyes didn't celebrate. He simply went to the prison, wearing the same coat, carrying the same notebook, and sat down across from the man in a cold interview room. He opened the case file. He laid out the photo. He asked the question, "Do you remember Grace?" The man stared at the photo, eyes narrowed. No. Reyes didn't argue. He closed the file, thanked him, and left. But he knew the DNA would speak. The courts would listen. Another file would be closed. That night, he walked the streets of the Bronx, snow now beginning to fall again, dusting the sidewalks. He found himself outside Mona Lisa's mural. The paint faded further, the bricks, worn with time. He placed his gloved hand on the wall. "You started this," he whispered, "and I'm not done." Back at the precinct, he added Grace's name to a new board. The red leather notebook now held 5 names. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing justice in its most stubborn form, the kind buried beneath laziness, lost evidence, and forgetfulness. His trench coat carried the smell of old libraries and winter streets. His turtleneck now fit looser, age starting to show, but his eyes were still sharp. And every time he looked at a cold file, it was like he was looking into a storm and daring it to blink. The chewing gum had solved a murder, but it had done more than that. It had reminded the city that time doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. Reyes would follow every delay until the very end. Detective Daniel Reyes stood at the edge of the East River at sunrise, the skyline washed in gold, his charcoal trench coat wrapped tightly around him, the black turtleneck beneath still sharp against the morning chill, his hands in his pockets. As he watched the city begin again, just as he had, case by case, memory by memory. It had been a year since the chewing gum closed Mona Lisa's case, and in that time, Reyes had helped solve for more cold cases, each one untangled through a forgotten clue, a scrap of fabric, a whispered name, a single drop of blood that hadn't meant anything until someone decided to listen. His office wall was now covered in red string, connecting cases, places, and faces. A map, not just of crime, but of resolve. What started with one girl had become something far bigger, a quiet revolution of attention. A reminder that justice doesn't fade, it waits. Reyes had declined promotions. He had turned down interviews, awards, even a book deal. "The story isn't mine," he always said. "I just carry it." And carry it he did through long nights and empty streets, across courtroom benches and silent graveyards. He visited each victim's family after their case closed, not to offer closure, because there's no such thing, but to offer truth. And in each meeting, he wore the same coat, the same turtleneck, as if he were the keeper of something sacred, consistency in a world that often forgot. That winter, the precinct assigned him a new partner, young and eager, fresh out of academy training. She asked questions constantly about his process, about his notebooks, about why he always carried a pocket watch instead of a phone. Reyes answered when he could, stayed silent when he couldn't. "You don't chase closure," he told her once. "You chase clarity. Closure is for books. Clarity is for the living." Together, they reopened the case of a missing boy from 1998. The file was thin, No evidence. Just a photo, a single recorded interview with a witness who had since passed, and a note scribbled in red pen. Look behind the shed. Reyes stared at that note for days. Who wrote it? Why was it ignored? He and his partner visited the site now parking lot and found nothing, but Reyes kept digging. He requested land records, talked to an old groundskeeper who remembered digging a trench behind that shed. In the summer of '99, a cadaver dog was brought in. Bones were found. DNA confirmed the identity. The boy had been there all along, waiting. Behind a wall of assumption, Reyes added the boy's name to the red notebook. That night, he went to the mural of Minalis again. The paint was cracking. He touched the wall and whispered, 6. He didn't smile. He never smiled when cases closed. It wasn't joy, it was gravity. One morning, Reyes received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, faded and curled. A teenage girl standing in a hallway. On the back, it read, she never made it home. 2003. No name. No location. No explanation. Reyes took it to the lab. Nothing conclusive, no digital match, no record of the photo online. He took it to missing persons. Nothing came up. He pinned it to the board anyway, because sometimes a ghost needed time to find its voice. His new partner asked why he bothered. What if it's a prank? Reyes turned to her and said, then I waste a few hours. But if it's real, she's been waiting 20 years. I think we can wait a little longer for her. And so, the Polaroid remained, a mystery within mysteries. Over time, Reyes began teaching seminars to rookies not about forensics or paperwork, but about patience, about sitting with silence, about respecting the dead. He showed them Minaliz's case, the gum, the photo, the box. He told them that evidence is not magic, it's memory. He never dramatized the cases. He let the facts speak. Some rookies cried, some rolled their eyes, but some just a few left with a new kind of fire in them. One of those rookies later solved the 30-year-old case using fiber evidence pulled from a coat. Reyes sent her a message, keep listening, years passed. Reyes began to slow. The coat fit looser. The notebook filled faster. His eyes, though still sharp, grew tired. One afternoon, after solving a case involving a missing woman from 1996, Reyes returned to his desk and stared at the Polaroid again. No answers, no leads, just a hallway and a girl. He whispered, not yet. That evening, as he walked home through the fading light, a child bumped into him on the sidewalk. Sorry, mister, the boy said. Reyes smiled, the first in days. Be safe, he replied. He turned the corner. The mural of Minalis stood, tall, freshly painted. Someone had restored it. He didn't know who, but it didn't matter. She watched over the street now, over him, over the city. Reyes stood in front of it, hands in pockets, coat swaying gently. He was tired, but not done. The chewing gum had closed one case, but it had opened hundreds, and as long as the silence spoke, he would listen.